Welcome back. You're watching NewsX. My name is Vinny. The United States has imposed 50% tariffs on around $20 billion worth of Canadian goods after 3 days of trade talks failed to produce a deal. The tariffs took effect after a deadline set by U.S. President Donald Trump expired, with Washington and Ottawa unable to resolve their differences. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has announced that Canada will respond with dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs targeting U.S. exports, including steel, dairy products, appliances, agricultural machinery, paper and electronics. Carney said that the U.S. had put forward terms that were uneconomic and unfair, while U.S. Trade Representatives Jamieson Greer blamed Canada for failing to finalize the agreement. The new U.S. tariffs will affect roughly 5% of Canadian exports to the United States, adding to existing duties on Canadian steel, lumber and automobiles. Economists warn that the measures could hit Canadian exporters hard, while U.S. consumers could also face higher prices on affected products. Let's talk about this with our guest. Joining us on the show at this point in time is Dr. Sharad Kohli, Senior Economist, Major General G.G. Dwivedi, Defense and Geopolitical Expert, Mr. Adit Kothari, International Affairs Expert, and last but by no means the least, Ambassador Suresh Kumar Goyal, former diplomat. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with us. Ambassador Goyal, I'll begin with you, sir. Well, Americans obviously have relied on Canada for decades now. In fact, there came a point, or there has always been this point, that it was very difficult to separate Canada from the United States. You know, the accents are similar, there is a porous border and what have you. But all of this does not mean anything as long as Donald Trump is the president. And that's exactly what he's proved today as well. Ambassador Goyal.
Vinny, thank you very much and good evening. And when you said I'm the last, I was really hoping to be the last, but clearly my hopes have been belied. Vinny, Canada and the USA, despite all terms of accents and everything, are different countries, like India and Pakistan are. So just remember that part, that the national sovereignty and the national interests, they prevail whatever nationality you may have been, number one. Number two, I think I was reading somewhere that besides the tariff negotiations, the US side on the last day of the negotiations, and I think that is what the Canadian side meant when they talked about uneconomic terms, that the US side seemed to have given a certain list of conditions and demands which are not purely economic in nature, but which could be geopolitical and strategic for the trade agreement to be signed. And those terms clearly, even if I look at them in a very preliminary kind of a fashion, they would be totally unacceptable to any country with any kind of a pride in their own dignity and freedom. For example, I believe that one of the conditions is that any proposal for investments related to infrastructure, they must be subject to approval by a U.S.-Canada committee. And that would basically give a USA a functional veto on whatever the Canada wants to invest in. Now, that kind of a thing, I would think, would be unacceptable. There are many others, and they have been referred to in the various communications. For example, in the pharmaceuticals, Canada is to be mandated to extend the patent protection by the USA. And there is a condition, for example, that for the critical minerals, Canadian exports will be subject to the USA first right of refusal. I think they are the kind of things which no self-respecting country will ever accept. And therefore, I would say that if the USA is going to expand the trade negotiations beyond tariffs and come to impact on the decision-making powers and the sovereignty of Canada itself, I think that they need to rethink. And therefore, I do believe that what Carney did was absolutely right, because it is not a question of tariffs anymore. It's a question of Canadian sovereignty.
You're absolutely right, sir. Dr. Kohli, it's a question of, Canada's sovereign will as well. Do you think that even this standoff that we are seeing today with Canada and the United States is temporary in nature, considering the fact that most of the things that Donald Trump has threatened and warned to do may have not happened in the past?
Oh yes, good evening, Vinny, to you, my fellow panelists and the viewers. Yes, if you go by the taco phenomena, which is getting more and more popular across the world now, we call it as taco. We all know what taco is all about. So if you go by taco, what you're saying is totally correct. Well, this may not effectively come down to be a realistic threat when it comes to implementation, because 8th of September is what Canada says it's going to get back to US on dollar for dollar. Tit for tat. This cannot be a bullying tactic as has been done by America over the last more than 1.5 years now. I mean, there is pressure being exerted on practically everything that America is doing. I mean, if you see the policies uniformly, for anything for that matter, tariff, of course, has been the favorite of all, starting from January 2025, especially 2nd of April 2025, when the reciprocal tariffs came into effect. It's been a clear bullying tactic, my way or the highway. Either you listen to me or I'm going to do just what I'm going to do. $720 billion we need is the bilateral trade between US and Canada. Second largest trading partner after Mexico. Mexico is $900 billion plus. Canada comes second, supposed to be the younger brother, heavily dependent, both the countries on each other. As you rightly said, porous borders. I've crossed Buffalo borders so many times, back and forth into both the countries. It hardly, you fly from Toronto to New York, it's less than 1 hour. You don't even come to know when you've crossed the borders. So, with such kind of a neighbor, when your fruits, your vegetables, your machinery, pharmaceuticals, electronics, uranium, there's so many things which are being exchanged from both the sides. Electricity to a certain extent, crude oil to a certain extent. So I just fail to understand that how can things be taken for granted that whatever I say, because I'm the more powerful country, and let me not call it the most powerful after $40 trillion of debt. I don't want to call America most powerful country anymore. I'm sorry to say that, being an economist, from an economic perspective, and the fact that they ran out of Patriot missiles sooner than one could have imagined, I call it more powerful of the two, not the most powerful. So, more powerful, I mean, you should have had a more magnanimous thinking. That, I agree with Ambassador Goel, you have to respect the sovereignty of the other country. After all, you want to, for example, one of the issues is which we had with India, push the agri and dairy into Canada. Now, Mark Kearney, as a matter of fact, every country and every head of the state has a right to protect the national interest. Canada has got a very brilliant agri and dairy setup of its own. It's a very large country. And how can you expect that your agri and dairy is flooded into the Canadian market? They have a right to protect their own market. And President Trump wants to force that. If you agree to me, or there's going to be 50% tariff. Well, tariff seems to be the answer to all problems across the world, which unfortunately is not true. So I think President Trump will have to understand that it can't go this way. If he's trying to protect his MAGA base, the Make America Great Again group, which is there, he's heading for a very tough elections in November, midterm polls, very tough. I mean, the preliminary survey says, the primary says that Republicans may not be doing well. Today he made a statement in the morning that if I lose the elections, I might be impeached. So for God's sake, why would you do things where you have a risk of being impeached, for that matter? So I think, not that I stand with Canada. I've got no interest of standing with Canada. But generally the approach of America, as it has been with several other countries, look at the Indian bilateral. Till date, it remains in the limbo. Although we keep hearing about it's almost final, it's nearing the end, and so on and so forth. What about that partisan group bill? If that comes, 100% tariffs. So nothing seems to be certain as far as supply chains and global trade is concerned. And this is reflecting on the capital markets, on the financial markets, on the commodity markets. This whole uncertainty and instability we need is impacting the global economy. And I would not hesitate to say that it is pushing the world on the brink of a recession. Vineet.
Jal Dwivedi, what are your thoughts, sir? Is this gotten too much, this tariff business that Donald Trump has initiated?
Well, Vinit, firstly, thanks for having me on your show. And being in New York, I always pick up the first newspaper, New York Times. And today there was a very balanced article, Canada-US trade war, what to know. So I'm going to draw somewhat from this article. Well, firstly, the article rightly says that US and the Canada, their economies are so well integrated. And today they are in a economic war scenario. So we need to go back a little bit, a point in time, as to why this situation has so developed over last about 1.5, 2 years. You know, when President Trump came to power for the second time, the relation between Canada and US began to get strained because he made some very provocative statements that Canada is the 51st state, the borders are arbitrary, and that exactly reflected upon the sovereignty of Canadians. And you know, if you go back to Davos this year meeting, Prime Minister Carney had said that America is no more a stabilizing factor in the global today, and middle powers like Canada have to survive in these circumstances. So this is the little bit of geopolitical background and how it has translated into the economic war between Canada and US. Now, there are three, four factors which need to be understood as to firstly the negotiations were on track, but certainly on 21st of this month they collapsed because Canada made some additional demands like streamlining their own content, labeling the bilingual and the French connect, and also they were looking at certain concessions from the dairy, aluminium, and steel. Now, this is where the fracturing took place, and then President Trump said that okay, we are imposing 50% more tariffs, and America imports about $382 billion worth of goods. So $20 billion additional tariff imposed, and that's what actually now has turned into a trade war. And Prime Minister Carney has rightly said that they will retaliate, of course, dollar for dollar, but nonetheless, Canada is not going to compromise on its sovereignty. Now, where do they go from here? The point is that the relations between Canada and US are very historic, and possibly this could be seen as one of the passing phase where the situation could stabilize, but another 2 years or 2.5 years are still to go. So therefore, I think this standoff is likely to continue because both sides have taken very fixed positions, and Trump is not going to scale down on the tariffs, and Carney is not going to buckle down. So the point is we are going to see this heated trade war for some time to come, but I think in the long term, given the geopolitical, geoeconomic ties between the two countries, this situation would stabilize in time to come. Vineet.
That's a good point, Nadit. Uh, it is true that America is not that stabilizing factor in the world anymore, and that's owing to obviously the eccentricities that we have seen by Donald Trump. One would hope that, you know, as the midterm elections got closer and with the setback in Iran, you know, there would be some sense of maturity that would prevail. But I guess not.
So the sense of maturity is there because if you look at the messaging is typically to the MAGA crowd. Because Trump's entire 2.0 presidency has been extremely inward-looking. It's been extremely insulative, and which is what is doing away the American hegemony, globally speaking, and it's also shrinking the faith in America as a reliable partner. And that's just not with Canada. I mean, Canada, yes, of course, is one of the closest allies. It's intertwined to America, as Dr. Kohli said, almost to the tune of $1 trillion of trade between the two economies. So yes, there is that shrinking sort of faith in America's being a legitimate partner. But that is also a global phenomenon. If you look at United Kingdom, for example, if you look at Japan, India, which was a rising star within the sort of American cahoots from a relationship building perspective, right from the Vajpayee era. Today, if you look at the Indo-American relations, we're at a complete dump at the moment. But whatever America is doing at the moment, the net beneficiaries of this are going to be China and India at the end of the day. Just like how the EU expedited the India-EU FTA, similarly, we will see benefits of the Indo-Canada deal also being expedited, probably get signed sometime around December, and as a consequence, India will also be beneficiary of the modular nuclear reactors. And at the end of the day, we will also benefit a lot with the Indo-Canadian trade. Uh, from domestically speaking, the Democrats are starting to take a lot of advantage of whatever Trump is doing. And they will constantly advertise, especially around the border regions, about the kind of tariff war, that the consequences that it's having on American pockets. Because ultimately, the tariffs are not being borne only by Canada; they're also being borne by the American purchaser, the American markets in general. So it's the middle class which is going to be impacted the most, and that economic backlash is going to be huge, even if it's just 5% of the imports which are being targeted. And this is where I think Donald Trump has faltered massively, because when you have people like Howard Lutnick who completely disconnected from ground realities and are completely marred by their myopia and their mercantilism, this is the kind of relations that you see. I'm very scared of a world where American hegemony dies and then you have Chinese hegemony calling the shots, because you do not want a non-democratic state calling the shots in the world geopolitics and the geoeconomics beneath.
Okay, that's a good point. Ambassador Goel, how do you respond to that? That did bring a smile to your face. China taking place of the United States will not be a very good sight for the world. So you muted.
I'm sorry, Vineet. And I was saying, Vineet, I don't care about the impact on the world. I mean, even though we are part of the globe. But my concern is, where does India stand in the whole situation? China is our continental neighbor, and there is a pressure on Indian borders because of China. It's a security issue for us. It is not just a geoeconomic issue for us. And therefore, if there is a contest between the USA and China, for me, the issue is not USA, what the USA tariffs. For me, the issue really is, are we going to allow China to really override Indian security concerns because of what the USA wants? Or are we going to allow the USA to take advantage of India because China is our immediate neighbor? And therefore, we are in a very prickly situation. We need to be more careful about where our interests lie. Now, therefore, I don't even want to think about China for the time being. That's entirely a different issue and requires great care to deal with it really. So let me come back to the USA. Now, if you talk about Canada, our interest in what is happening in Canada is, will it impact on what our interests are, our trade interests, our geopolitical interests? Now, for example, I understand that the USA wants Canada to match the sanction regime of the USA. So does it mean that the USA has sanctions on doing anything to do with Iran? Canada will have to do the same? Does it mean pharmaceuticals? If Canada has to look to the USA to extend their imports of generic medicines from India, where do we stand? And therefore, I would really see here that unless some sense comes into the USA and realize that USA and Canada is not just a trade and economic relationship, and more importantly, Arctic. Trump's ambition is to convert Arctic into a kind of a marina, a touristic resort kind of a thing, even though security is more important, but he has got all kinds of, and he wants Canada to be a partner in what the US ambitions are. And for India, the Arctic is critically important. If you look at all the connectivity projects and what is happening in West Asia now, we know that unless we diversify our routes, we are in a deep shit creek. I'm sorry, I didn't want to use the word, but that is where we will be. And therefore, the Arctic is important for us to develop alternative connectivity routes. And if the USA is going to control the Arctic in its own interest, where do we stand? And therefore, what I'm saying here, Vineet, is that the USA attitude to be the bull in the China shop is portends even greater dangers to India than China by itself. Vineet.
Dr. Kohli, concluding thoughts from you and General Dwivedi and Adit, 30 seconds each, and then we wrap up.
Well, I feel, this whole trade business, and I liked what Adit said, we might be the beneficiary of this. Although I still believe from where I started that the taco thing is going to work out. This is effectively not going to convert to ground, because who pays the tariffs at the end of the day? It is the American people who's going to pay, the importers in America. Look at what Supreme Court did. It ordered $100 billion of refund of tariffs, which is now being refunded from the Treasury. Look at the situation of bonds in US. There is an alarm raised on the bond that the bond, the entire fiscal position of America, after 1.5 years or more than 1.5 years of President Trump's regime, look at what is the fiscal position of America. All that he wanted has pretty much been reversed. Look at what is happening in Iran. So I think the situation is very, very grim at this point of time. He has to save his grace. And I think as he gets closer to elections, we will see such kind of rhetorics. But at the end of the day, he will have to look at the interest of the American people, who are already reeling under severe inflation. Look at the gas prices. General Dwivedi is there. I'm sure he must be visiting a petrol station. Look at the gas prices, almost $4 a gallon, in a little bit here and there in different states. But I think he will have to, at the end of the day, look at the interest of not of MAGA, but of American people in general, Vineet.
All right, General Dwivedi.
Yes, Vineet, firstly, inflation definitely is visible across America. All the retail prices have gone up. But I like to focus on one very important point. That is how China and US are going to now figure out the G2 meeting, which is going to take place in September. The Chinese economy is quite in bad shape. In fact, Chu Rongji's funeral drew a lot of legacy of his legacy, a very muted way in China. So therefore, I think Chinese are looking at how they can bail themselves out by having a G2 type of relation with America, and that's what will be the greatest concern, not only of India, but the globe at large, because when the two economies or the two countries come together to try and shape the global order, I'm sure India and the other middle powers are going to feel the pinch very severely, Vineet.
All right, Adit, concluding thoughts?
So concluding thoughts for me is that I do admire Mark Carney, because Mark Carney's demonstrated spine. He's visibly standing up to a bully. And let's not forget that he is a former banker himself. So he's done the mathematics behind both the tariffs and the retrospective tariffs that Canada will now be applying to the United States. And visibly, what I really admired is the rest of the polity in Canada, whether it's the Premier from British Columbia or whether it's Doug Ford, the Premier from Ontario, standing behind the Prime Minister and saying, we will not take this lying down. This is disrespecting the sovereignty of Canada, and Trump cannot be allowed to bully Canada as their 51st state.
And he's not Governor Carney like Governor Trudeau.
Fair enough. All right. Great perspectives. Thank you, gentlemen, for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you.
We've run out of time. We'll take a short break now. Be right back.